My father's will contained a single sentence that banished my brother from our childhood home forever. In this video, I'll tell you why. This isn't a story with a happy ending. It's an honest look at how a father's unspoken grievances and final words can create a wound that may never fully heal between two brothers. This is a story for anyone who understands the complex dynamics of a family, especially in times of grief. Because inheritances are so much more than money or property, aren't they? Often, they are a parent's last and final statement. And they can bring peace, or, as you'll see in my family's case, they can become the trigger for lifelong resentment. I am the sister caught in the middle of it all, a witness to the love, the tension, and ultimately the breakdown of the relationship between my two brothers, Leo and Mark. We were all gathered in the office of our family's lawyer, Mr. Gable. The air was heavy. You know? Full of that grief no one speaks aloud and an anxiety we all felt. We were there to hear our father's last words, little knowing that some of those words would echo for a long, long time. To understand the will, you must first understand my father. He was a man of principle. A builder by trade. And he believed in solid foundations, both in the homes he built and in the family he raised. He was fair and hard-working, but not a man who showed his feelings easily. His approval was something we all sought, and his disappointment was a heavy silence that could fill an entire room. He loved my brothers, Leo and Mark, but his relationships with them were very different. Leo, the eldest, was methodical and responsible, much like our father. Mark, on the other hand, was the dreamer. Impulsive, artistic, often seen by my father as brilliant but directionless. My father believed that actions were the true measure of a person's character. He didn't easily praise, but he showed his love through the support and stability he provided us. And he saw these qualities manifest very differently in his children. Looking back, I can see that he saw his will not simply as a distribution of assets, but as his final project. A structure designed to last generations. He planned every detail, ensuring that every beam and joint was placed with purpose. But he failed to consider the human emotions that would inhabit this structure after he was gone. Nothing in his will was an accident. Every word was chosen with the same precision he used to measure a cut in wood. This precision highlighted the fundamental differences between Leo and Mark. From an early age, they were like two sides of the same coin. Leo was the protector, the rule follower. The son who stayed close to home, always present at Sunday dinners. Mark, on the other hand, was the wanderer. Charismatic and creative, always pursuing a new passion, a new city, a new dream. He brought unpredictability to our lives, but his path was a source of concern for our father. My father respected his talent but worried about his lack of stability. He saw his lifestyle as a foundation built on sand, not stone. Despite their differences, their connection was incredibly strong. Leo was Mark's anchor, often helping him out of financial difficulties. Mark was Leo's window to a world of spontaneity. They complemented each other. But as they grew older, the fractures began to widen. Life took them in different directions. The easy camaraderie of youth was replaced by a more formal, somewhat strained affection. They still loved each other, of course, but the ground between them had shifted, becoming unstable long before the earthquake that was our father's will. On the day of the reading, these fractures felt like chasms in that silent room. Leo sat straight-backed, his face a mask of composed grief. Mark was the opposite. Huddled in his chair, his eyes searching for an escape. I sat between them, a futile attempt to serve as a bridge. He could feel the tension radiating from both sides. Mr. Gable, the lawyer, finally cleared his throat. He began reading at a slow, measured pace. The opening sections were straightforward. Leo would be the executor, which surprised no one. Then came some specific bequests to distant relatives and charities. For a moment, I began to relax. The will seemed to be exactly what we'd hoped for, a fair and loving final testament. Then Mr. Gable moved on to the main assets, the family home, savings accounts, and investments. He stated our father's wish that everything be liquidated and the proceeds divided into 3 equal portions. One for each of his children. It was perfectly equitable. An almost audible sigh of relief filled the office. It seemed our fears were unfounded. But the reading wasn't over. Mr. Gable paused, took a sip of water. It was a small gesture, but it changed the entire atmosphere. He looked at us, and his expression was no longer routine. There was one last section, he explained, a late addition to the document. There's a codicil, Mr. Gable announced, his voice now lacking its former warmth. He explained that a codicil is an addendum, a supplementary document added to an existing will. This one had been drafted and signed just 6 months before our father's passing. The news hit the room like a rock. A last-minute change. Why? What could be so important that he would change everything at the end? The fragile unity we'd felt moments before began to crack. If it wasn't about the money, then what was it about? My father wasn't a man of dramatic gestures. Any change he made had to have a reason he considered deeply important. Mr. Gable adjusted his glasses. This addendum, he said, his voice a little lower, concerns a single property. The family cabin on Silver Lake. The mention of the cabin, a place with so many shared memories, sent a chill through me. It didn't have much monetary value, but its sentimental value was immense. That cabin was the archive of our childhood. Summers spent there, learning to fish, telling ghost stories around the campfire. It was our shared sanctuary. For Leo, the cabin represented tradition and legacy. For Mark, it was a place of freedom and inspiration. And for me, it was the place where we were simply brothers. So when Mr. Gable announced that the codicil was about the cabin, it felt deeply personal. It wasn't about dividing up a piece of property, it was about assigning ownership of our collective memory. Mr. Gable cleared his throat and read directly from the page. With respect to the property at 14 Silver Lake Road, known as the family cabin, he began, I bequeath said property and its contents in their entirety to my eldest son, Leo. A sharp silence followed. I looked at Mark. His face was a canvas of shock and disbelief. The cabin was for all of us. The idea of it belonging to just one person was unthinkable. Leo, however, remained impassive. He probably saw this as a logical decision, entrusting the family legacy to the most capable hands. He must have assumed we would all continue to be welcome. But my father's words weren't over. Mr. Gable continued reading, and the next sentence was what changed everything. This bequest, he read, is made upon a specific and legally binding condition. The word condition hung in the air, heavy and ominous. What condition could our father possibly demand in exchange for an old cabin? Mark's shock began to turn into simmering anger. A condition? What kind of condition? He asked, his voice low and strained. Mr. Gable took a deep breath, as if bracing himself for the impact of the words he was about to utter. The condition is this, he read, his voice firm. Ownership of the cabin is contingent upon the agreement that my youngest son, Mark, will not be allowed to set foot on the property, for any reason, for the rest of his natural life. The silence in the room became absolute, stunned. The words were so brutal. So final. Mark was being explicitly and permanently banished from the place that held our most cherished family memories. Can you imagine the shock? To feel like your own father was erasing you from the family history? It was a cruel and inexplicable act coming from a man we'd always believed to be just. Mark just stared at the lawyer, his mouth hanging open. Then he slowly turned his head to Leo. His expression was a storm of pain, betrayal, and pure rage. In that moment, I saw the bond between them break. He believed Leo needed to know. Leo's face was pale with shock. I don't understand, he stammered. There must be a mistake. Why would he do this? But there was no mistake. The words were there, in black and white. This was the clause that changed everything. This was no longer about the cabin. This was the final, terrible statement our father had made. If you've ever witnessed a moment that you know will change your family forever, I hope you'll consider signing, because the aftermath was even more difficult than the revelation. The silence was finally broken by Mark's harsh, bitter laugh. So that's it, he said, his voice shaking with anger and pain. "Your last act on earth is to expel me." He stood up so abruptly that his chair scraped the floor. His burning gaze was fixed solely on his brother. Leo also stood up. "Mark, wait. This is obviously a misunderstanding. I had no idea. We can dispute that." But to Mark, Leo's calm, rational response felt like an insult. "Settle?" Mark retorted. "There's nothing to settle. You get the cabin, and I'm banished. A good deal for you, isn't it?" The accusation was clear. He believed Leo was, at best, an accomplice. Mark grabbed his coat and headed for the door. "You can have the damn cabin," he spat at Leo. "I hope you're happy there." And with that, he left, slamming the door behind him. The legal reading was over, but the emotional trial had only just begun. In the days that followed, the situation only worsened. Mark refused to answer my calls or Leo's. When he finally texted, it was a torrent of fury. He accused Leo of poisoning our father's mind against him in his final months. He painted a picture of Leo as a manipulative opportunist. Mark's logic was fueled by grief and a lifetime of feeling like the family outsider. He pointed out that Leo had been the one who managed our father's affairs, the one who took him to appointments, including, presumably, his lawyer's appointments. He was there, whispering in his ear, Mark wrote to me, telling him I was a failure. And our father believed him. The accusation wounded Leo deeply. He was a man who prided himself on his integrity. Being accused of such a profound betrayal was an attack on his very character. He was being punished for his loyalty, for his presence. The injustice hardened his heart against Mark's pain, replacing his initial shock with defensive anger. The gulf between them grew with each message. When I finally reached Leo, his voice was cold. "I spent the last 2 years of Dad's life changing his tampons and making sure he took his medication," he said, his voice tight with resentment. Where was Mark? He called on birthdays and Christmas. He was too busy meeting with himself to be here. From Leo's perspective, our father's decision, though harsh, was logical. He had proven himself to be the trustworthy son. "It's not my fault," Leo insisted. "This is the consequence of Mark's life choices." The argument was no longer about the cabin. It had become a referendum on their entire lives. And Leo confessed that a part of him had always resented Mark's freedom. He didn't see the will as a punishment for Mark, but as a reward for himself. Unable to accept this, I decided I needed to find a reason. I couldn't believe the father who taught us fairness would do something so deliberately divisive. I began a quiet investigation in my father's office, rummaging through boxes of old documents, looking for a clue. But I found nothing. No mention of an argument with Mark. Nothing. My search then led me to the attic, to dusty photo albums. I was no longer looking for a legal or financial reason, but an emotional one. It was in a heavy leather album labeled Silver Lake, 1998, that I found the first real clue. As I flipped through the pages, a loose photograph fell to the floor. I picked it up. The photo was of my father and Mark, who was about 17 at the time. They were standing on the cabin's dock, fishing rods in hand. My father had his arm around Mark's shoulder, and they were both smiling, but there was a strange tension in their poses. I turned the photo over. On the back, in my father's careful handwriting, was a short, enigmatic note. Just 5 words, the day of the broken promise. A broken promise. What promise? What had happened that summer? The phrase, the broken promise, stirred a distant memory. I called my aunt, my father's sister, who had always been his closest confidant. I described the photo and the note. After a long pause, she sighed and told me a story I had never heard. That summer, Mark had fallen in with a group of older, rebellious friends. One weekend, while my parents were away, he broke a golden rule. He took our father's prized antique boat onto the lake without permission. He and his friends had been drinking. They ended up crashing the boat into a rocky ledge, causing significant damage. The boat was our father's treasured possession. Fearing our father's wrath, Mark made a desperate plea. He begged our father not to tell anyone, promising he would work all summer to pay for the repairs. He swore he would never be so reckless again. Our father, seeing his son's genuine remorse, agreed. He made a secret pact with him. But Mark broke that second, more important promise. He never got the money. He got distracted, and the repairs were quietly paid by our father. For my father, this was the ultimate betrayal. It wasn't the boat or the money. It was the lie. A failure of integrity he could never forget or forgive. He never spoke of it again, but it permanently altered his perception of Mark. In his eyes, Mark had proven himself untrustworthy. Armed with this painful truth, I knew I had to gather my brothers. I arranged to meet at a cafe. The tension was so thick I could barely breathe. I began by telling them about the photograph and the note. Then I related the story of the boat, the accident, and the 2 broken promises. I watched their faces as the decades-old secret was finally revealed. Mark's face went pale, a look of horror and shame replacing his anger. He remembered. Leo listened attentively. This new information didn't contradict his worldview, it confirmed it in the most dramatic way possible. It was the missing proof for his belief in his brother's fundamental irresponsibility. That's why, I said softly. It wasn't because of you, Leo. And it wasn't to punish you in the present, Mark. It was for something that happened a long time ago. Dad never got over it. I hoped this revelation would be a catalyst for understanding. But instead of fostering understanding, the revelation became the final piece of evidence that solidified their positions. Mark felt crushed by the weight of our father's resentment. To dwell on a teenage mistake for over 20 years, only to use it as a posthumous weapon, seemed unforgivably cruel. So all this time, he said, his voice hollow, whenever he looked at me, was this what he saw? The stupid kid who broke his precious boat? Leo, on the other hand, felt completely vindicated. History had proven that our father's decision was not a moment of senile cruelty, but a final, sensible judgment based on character. He looked at Mark, not with sympathy, but with a cold, renewed certainty. Dad knew who you were, Leo said, and the words fell like stones. He always knew. In that instant, Leo wasn't just defending our father, he was aligning himself with his judgment. He was choosing his father's memory over his living brother. That was the point of no return. The secret, once revealed, didn't heal the wound, it turned it into a ravine. Years have passed since that day. As dictated by our father's will, Leo is the sole owner of the cabin. Mark fulfilled the condition, never again setting foot on the property he loved so much. The 2 brothers haven't exchanged a word since that argument in the cafe. The silence between them is absolute. Leo maintains the cabin meticulously. He takes his children there, trying to recreate the summers of our youth. But he goes alone. The place now has a palpable sadness, an emptiness. It is no longer a sanctuary of family unity, but a monument to its division. Mark has channeled his grief into his art. He has created a series of powerful paintings that have brought him success, but he is emotionally isolated from his family. I remain stuck in the middle, maintaining separate and strained relationships with both. We are a family fractured into pieces. The cabin still stands, a silent witness to our history. It is a tragic symbol of how inheritance can be so much more than property. Our father, in his quest to teach a final lesson about integrity, left us a legacy of silence and permanent loss. He was a master builder, but the one structure that mattered most, our family, is now permanently and irreparably fractured. After hearing the whole story, I want to hear your thoughts. Who was right? My father, who was teaching a final lesson about responsibility? Or my brother, who was the victim of a decades-old grudge over a teenage mistake? Vote in the comments, #FairFather or #CruelFather. The debate is yours.